And we founded it with to try to answer the question, like, where does quality mental health need to reach that healthcare reach that it often doesn't? And then how do we just leverage telehealth to take it there? And so a lot of the work we have done is trying to figure out also then who is not included in terms of accessing mental health care, or maybe who wouldn't even do so if it required going to a physical spot where people in their community would see them. There's a host of different things that telehealth really opens up when it comes to mental health care entirely. We are in Texas. Unlike a lot of kind of companies in our boat, a huge percentage of our population are folks in the Medicaid system, including children in foster care, people who really could value and benefit from having continuity of care when they move around, things like that. We work with a huge population of active duty military service members and their families. A lot of folks in rural areas, and since that is not where a lot of mental health, especially sort of innovative companies, are focused, when it came time to expand, we were looking at states who particularly were underserved in terms of their coverage of mental health providers, access to that, and Kentucky got our attention. And the really interesting work that's going on in Bowling Green at the WKU Innovation Campus and in that area that's working on becoming its own really interesting tech and innovation ecosystem really got my attention as a repeat startup founder. I'm really intrigued by what's going on down there. And so when we decided to expand, I decided to move, and here you find me.
So could you describe why, you kind of talked about why you picked Kentucky, but can you dive a little bit deeper of why Kentucky was the right ecosystem for you to move Oria here and to start over a few of the others that we discussed?
Sure, yeah. So as I was talking to you guys this morning, saying that there's a ton, and we know this about almost all tech companies, certainly. There's an over-concentration of investment and energy and resources into cities and the coasts. Yep. And because of that, there are a host of states that are every state has its own needs in the mental health space, but there are a host of them that truly seem to have unique challenges that my team, who's very passionate, very mission-driven, was excited to potentially help. And so we ran a pilot project for a year with the Mississippi Department of Corrections, doing a dual diagnosis substance use disorder and trauma-informed program. We had amazing support from the people who had us do the program. We couldn't find sort of that larger support that we would need from the public sector to make change. Similarly, current climate in Texas, a lot of behavioral health and mental health is not quite the conversation that it is in other places, and that it is here. And so we were excited to start to figure out. Northwest Arkansas came up because they have a huge push towards both innovation and mental health. But for Kentucky, and for the sort of more South Central Kentucky, where I am now, I was particularly intrigued by hearing of an innovation ecosystem, an innovation campus. Like, this is a place where we try to bring in really new companies and new opportunities. And then people would say, so what would it take for you to come here? And they're asking that to many companies, not just us. And I sort of sat there and I'm like, well, I have a list of I would need a university partner, for some of the programs that we want to research. And ideally, an R2 university, not an R1 university, because R1 universities, I went to one, two-time Vandy grad, are amazing in the research they do. You have several great ones here, too. But they're not going to study the effectiveness of a telehealth intervention for substance use disorder, right? Like, that's not the type of research they do. So they're like, okay, well, we have WKU. Let's get you talking to the folks over there. I'm like, well, ideally, that university would also have clinical social work programs and personal counseling, psychiatric nurse practitioner. They're like, we have all three of those things. I'm like, okay. And I was like, well, I also would need public support, because there's so much, as you all know, the policy work that goes into the mental health space, especially when it comes to access. There are bizarre, little sentences that keep telehealth from being able to reach an area that needs it most. That you have to get into. Please remove this one thing that says you have to have a fire marshal visit to your intensive outpatient treatment if you don't have a site, that kind of thing. And then they brought city leaders and county leaders, and now have introduced me to some state leadership and change makers, and they put me in rooms with folks like you to say, and I've really never seen that type of genuine collaboration across a community, public, private, between companies. I've never seen anything like it. And having done startups my whole career in essentially competitive environments, it's very interesting to now be a part of what appears to be a collaborative ecosystem.
I love to hear that. That's really good to hear from the state perspective as you talk about startups and early stage companies. You tapped into this a little bit already, talking about when you think about health equity and healthcare, you want to make sure people who need access to it can receive it.
Right.
And what are some of the challenges you see when it comes to access to the healthcare and services, and particularly rural areas, and how is Oria really attacking those challenges?
Great question. So some of them are just logistic, and we know it. Internet connectivity, right? High speed enough to have a two-way AV, as the world's written communication. We've done some interesting things, and we're constantly in test and iterate mode, right? Which is not what you think of when you think of any type of healthcare practice, right? Like there are a lot of really interesting like tech platforms, but we're in this weird, and if anybody's an investor in the room, difficult to invest in space where we are actually offering the services, but we're doing that because doing that is teaching us what needs to get built and what needs to get addressed. And so, for example, we have a partnership with a online recovery program that's a curriculum that was out of a group in Louisiana. Dr. Doug Cook, who's a very well-known addiction specialist, has this program, and we used it in our Mississippi program. We're going to use it in some of our other rural programs where we truly have tablets with all of it downloaded and everything on it, that at this point it is significantly less expensive to hand someone a tablet you never expect to get back as part of the treatment protocol than it is to say, get in your car, drive 2 hours, take your afternoon off work where you don't get paid leave anyway. Right? And so I think there's just a ton of opportunity for, we use the term, we go where you go. And for providers, we say that as like where you try and take your career, or we have a lot of military spouses, so when they move, they don't have to get a new job because of the work they're doing with us as telehealth providers. But for our clients and for really the potential in the community, it's where are you? We will reach you there, right? And when you start thinking of it, you're like, well, yeah, I mean, that's meet people where they are. Meet people where they are and take them higher. Meet people in their context. Then those sound like things we agree on, but they're like, okay, so then take the mental health there, right? And there's some really interesting opportunity, not just to leverage telehealth, not just to leverage tech, but even then start thinking through what is it that is driving some of the mental health crises we have right now? What in communities, what in workplaces? Very passionate about that, very excited to hear this HR talk. What is it that, is it managers or pastors or teachers need to know about upstream effects of some of the mental health crisis, and where we're, so you especially get into areas where the crisis is bad, the coverage is really abysmal as well at this moment, then you can't just wait for licensed professionals to magically appear. I'm trying to help them magically appear, and trying to be able to recruit them from wherever and get them into the spaces they need to be. But we need to also, as a community, start understanding what it means to be more like mental health informed. Mm-hmm. I could talk all day and ramble, so I'm going to stop.
So, with that being said, what are some of the barriers that you see, and what are some of the easy buttons that regulators and governments can kind of push to help fulfill the mission of telehealth and helping increase access to healthcare?
Great question. So, a couple things I got to give you all credit as the Commonwealth. You're in motion on ahead of the place I came from. For example, there's this increasing move toward an interstate compact for different mental health licensures. There is one for social workers. Clinical social workers are core to everything that we're talking about here today. They're very uniquely suited and trained. There is a National Social Work Board. I think 17 states have opted into a compact to potentially have reciprocity. Let me tell you a really specific reason that matters. Yes, there are. What if there aren't enough mental health providers living in Kentucky or in spaces where people can get to them? There's also the continuity of care issue. The number one reason somebody stops their care at Oria is because they moved across state lines, and so I'm not allowed to keep seeing them, even though the provider has my providers, they've never met in person anyway. Like, why would that matter, right? And there are easy buttons there. And, I kind of blissfully at the beginning of this journey was like, put that on the list of stuff I'm gonna change. And then, so I met with a policy attorney at, I think, month 2 of the company, and he goes, the 10th Amendment, that's why that's a problem. And I was like, oh, That does seem like that could be difficult to choose. But you know, but again, in terms of, you know, I don't know that anything's an easy button, but truly, like I had again, community sports, Bowling Green Chamber of Commerce, the Judge Executive Warren County, Doug Warman, where they're like, do you have like a specific thing we could help you with? I'm like, there is literally a line in the code of being able to put in, like, deploy any type of intensive outpatient treatment that requires a physical address. That's fine, but then the address has to be where services are, even if they do telehealth services too. And specifically, I can get around this, this, and this. I can't get around that I can't get a certification to operate a quality evidence-based program until I have the fire marshal who has come to approve the rooms for treatment. And I'm like, help me here, you know? And that's a little one of my battle cries right now, because I mean, we came here because the reality is it's not just that there isn't access, but when you really talk equitable access.
Yeah.
If I am self-employed technically, if I woke up tomorrow in a deep mental health crisis, I'm not losing my job. If I did that for a month, I'm not losing my house, right? If I sat up here on this stage and told you I've been there, I've lived it, you would hear that as lived experience and something I've overcome. Those could not be 3 more privileged facts, right? I mean, just unreal. And I did struggle with my mental health. I still try to figure out the right way to talk about it now. I was very secretive about it in my early startup career, very secretive. And meeting Dr. Connell, starting this company obviously has made me have a different tune. But you know, I would like think about, I'm educated, white, I have all the ability in the world to navigate the healthcare system because I've been in healthcare, I have resources, I've always had insurance, and it was still almost impossible to navigate and get the mental health care I needed. Think about that. If it's hard for me, the hell is happening to everyone else, right? Like, I mean, that's the deal, you know? And that's a lot of where our heart is, right? I mean, it's just the, you know, Dr. Connell always says, like, that phone call someone makes to our practice, it's like, maybe it's the hardest call they've ever had to make. I mean, there's a stat that I hear a lot running around right now that's for the average person who's been struggling with severe, like, major depressive disorder or other, what we'll call severe, they're not technically severe mental illness, which is like a real term, but somebody whose life is drastically affected by what's going on with their mental health. Usually by the time they tell a doctor about it, they've felt that way for 11 years. And when you think about it, like, when I heard that, I was also in a room of people who made that sound. And so I love it that it lands every time. And I went, yeah, that tracks. I was probably at least that long before I ever talked about it. And what's interesting is I also remember being floored, and now you got me on the soapbox, so I'll come back, I promise. Floored the first time that I heard some of the key diagnoses for anxiety and depression require, how often have you felt this way in the last 2 weeks? I'm like, 2 weeks? Like, what? You know, and so that's where I start thinking about like upstream effects, right? What if I had better tools? What if I knew how to think about my own thoughts? You know, when I was a kid and when I was in this terrible space, and so many kids are right now, right? So anyway, all that to say, telehealth, when we talk about equitable access, look, I got all the way back. Specifically, we are not thinking through how impactful that reach could be, because again, if you work an hourly job, you don't get to just say, I'm going on PTO for 2 hours. If you have transportation limitations, you don't get to just drive to an appointment. You don't maybe have to drive 3 hours, right? And so like a big thing I've been talking to actually employers about is, you know, and this can be difficult sometimes with payers, sometimes not, depends, but with employers, like we have data now that's showing us that people who are like struggling with substance use disorder or other issues that are severe enough to, you know, we typically put them into an inpatient setting. We are now seeing that if you keep somebody in their community, in their context, going to work with their children, not at risk of losing their children by admitting they need help, they actually get better and have better long-term results. Like, that is profound, and I don't know why that is not the thing everyone is everywhere saying, right? And making it so that you know, get off work at 5, you're in intensive outpatient therapy for 2 hours at night while the kids are doing homework. You're in one room, they're in another, right? I mean, you use a lunch hour once a week to talk to your psychiatrist, another, you know, I mean, there's so much opportunity to fit intervention into our lives. But as long as we keep saying it's a brick and mortar building, go over there and get in the queue and have a wait list and somebody will get back to you, like, we're not gonna move the needle.
Yeah, I love that, Amanda. I think that is so important. We had the conversation with, particularly with founders, even having more increase in mental health issues and making sure that we address those issues. So I think it's definitely an opportunity for us to go there, have a deeper conversation there, because I think it's one that we don't have enough of. As we close out, I really want to hear what's your vision for the future of healthcare? And then particularly, we talk about collaboration and the importance of that, right? So for those in the room, businesses and corporate partners, how can they potentially contribute to that vision that you have?
Appreciate that. Again, that could be a 2-hour thing. So I'm intrigued in our move beyond fee-for-service medicine. I am passionate about thinking through how to help people heal. Heal is not a word we use as much as you would think, especially in behavioral health. Some of that has an origin, I'm oversimplifying, around reducing stigma, right? Like if we got people used to the idea of like, you're not cured of depression, or you won't heal from schizophrenia, you manage it, you learn to live with it, you have supports, you need supports, right? That's great, but I also think you can heal from trauma, we know that. And a lot of the things that we are seeing writ large in mental health are effects of trauma. And we also all just lived through, for the first time in our lifetime, and maybe 3 lifetimes, a extended period of traumatic stress.
Yes.
So what do you think is gonna happen if we don't start thinking through how to heal from trauma?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's gonna be a lot there in healthcare. And you know, if this rabbit hole is your thing, like there's a very well-known book called The Body Keeps the Score. It talks quite a bit about how our bodies, our physical health is impacted by our mental health. And people kind of can hear that and go, well, you know, yeah, I get it. Like, no, maybe you're drinking too much, you're not taking care of yourself. Like, no, literally. Like, here's a correlation with inflammation from traumatic stress to cancer, to diabetes. These words, these things that are getting worse, it's almost like they're inextricably linked. So I look forward to a version of healthcare that not only helps people heal, has providers trying to figure out how to be effective, and it's not to say they're not doing amazing and sacred work right now, but like everybody's stretched too thin. Like getting a program and having people like me and my leadership sitting down and be like, we're going to figure out how to make it easier for you to do the work you need to do, and track it and see what's going on, so that we can keep getting people on the path they need to be on and pivot if this isn't the path. And then I have a personal belief that while it is really great that there's been an emphasis in a lot of spaces on what they're calling behavioral health integration into a primary care setting. They ask you questions about your mood. You know what I'm talking about. There's some great regulations that have made it easier to access behavioral health care through a primary care provider. Great. I also think that if you have a relationship with a therapist or a counselor of some kind who is teaching you to think about yourself in a new way, is teaching you to be conscientious of your own thoughts and behaviors, then it's possible you're going to be more ready to work on your physical health once you have addressed your mental health.
Right.
And so I actually think I want to see a world where there's a general health integration into a mental health care practice. And it's not that I'm the only person saying that, right? It's not like a magical concept, but there are some bizarre blockers that the community can help us with. For example, with that vision, I hired a DO, who was family medicine, but more holistic, and hired a psychologist who had a fellowship in psychiatric nutrition, as in, what could you be doing, how could we be feeding you differently to possibly reduce the amount of medication you needed to take, possibly for mental health purposes, but possibly others, right? And neither of them work for us anymore because I couldn't get them paid because the contracts I had with payers were like, no, you're behavioral health. You can't have them. And I'm like, what? I mean, you talked about hills I tried to die on. I mean, it's hard. And, so I think, I empower, if there are people in the room who are self-insured employers especially, who have a lot of power to be like, no, we actually are good with that, let's do that thing, right? But then I need to have a relationship with you, and companies like mine need to. Some of the payers, especially knowing you've got such a big healthcare presence here, being able to think of providers as innovation partners. Not every provider wants to be, but it's bizarre. Like when I ran software companies, my relationships were in the C-suite. Now that I'm running a company where we actually deliver services to thousands of people a month, they're like, here's an email, you will get a bot response, and maybe someone will get back to you in 30 days. I kid you not. And I mean, I'll go to conferences and start to be like, and they're like, oh, and I'll talk to my old, truly like leadership people, contacts, and they'll be like, oh yeah, oh, here's the provider side now. I'll see who you need to talk to about that. And it starts the process over again. So those are some things that I think we can, as partners in the community, we can really, really think through. I think those of you, I've already met some of you today doing some really interesting work to help people who are in a mental health crisis, figuring out how to work together, figuring out how to make it, talk about an easy button like, here, let's just get you on the phone with somebody from Oria who will figure out, like, you can see where I'm going with this. Like, we just need to figure out how to kind of rally together and address these challenges where they come up, and just be willing to go, not be stuck by the way we've always done it, not be thinking about it in the path of least resistance, because usually equitable access is going to have a lot of resistance, and you're going to have to carry your machete into the woods and clear the path, right? And so anyway, I see our time, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a pleasure to get to meet you and hear about what you're doing, incredible work. Thank you again.
Thank you.